Welcome everyone to the Phoenix Report. I'm Jack Connor, and this video is a part of a series that I like to call a fireside pitch, in which I share with you some creative storytelling ideas I have for a particular series or a franchise. As you know, I've done many reviews on this channel of movies and TV shows, but I figured I'd challenge myself a little bit to come up with a story idea of my own. For example, if I was in charge of rebooting or remaking a popular movie or TV series, what would I do? After all, it's easy to be an armchair quarterback and critique, a movie or show or franchise that already exists. But what kind of story would I tell if I was in charge, or if I was a screenwriter or a showrunner or director, or whatever, of making creative decisions like this? Well, we are about to find out because I wanted to talk about this series in particular because I have been a huge fan of the Bill and Ted movies ever since I was a little boy. I think the first movie, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which was released in 1989, um, that came out. I would have been 5 years old at the time. I don't remember exactly when I first saw it or how old I was. I know it wasn't in the theaters. We had probably rented it a few times. Um, I couldn't have been much older than 5 or 6. I was still very young when I saw it. Um, yeah, I don't know why we rented it quite a bit or how we had heard about it, but I remember seeing it as a kid and loving it. Like I thought Bill and Ted were the funniest guys around. I thought they were great. Um, Part of it is, I was, I was always the youngest brother or youngest cousin or youngest, nephew, grandkid, whatever. So, I mean, it kind of reminded me of like what it would be like to hang out with my older cousins or something like that. Or, you know, like when I was little, I wanted so badly to be a teenager so I could hang out with Bill and Ted and play guitar and go on adventures through time or go on dates with beautiful princesses, the whole thing. Um, when I was little, I loved their Saturday morning cartoon spinoff, which is Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures, plural. I had Bill and Ted action figures that came with a cassette tape, and I remember playing with them all the time when I was in my room. I would use take them and put on concerts, with them along with my Ninja Turtle figures, the ones that came with instruments. So like there were many Wyld Stallyns slash Ninja Turtle concerts in my room growing up. So, and to this day, Bill S. Preston Esquire and Ted Theodore Logan are two of my favorite fictional characters in all of literature. Alex Winter and Keanu Reeves brought such charm and chemistry toward those characters that you can't help but like these guys. Um, it's hard to imagine anyone else playing those two characters. They're such an excellent duo. They're always loyal to each other, and those characters treat pretty much everyone they interact with. Pretty much they everyone they interact with, I should say, they treat everybody with kindness and friendship, and just an openness about it. Everyone's a dude or a babe, and they're very they're very equal that way. And I did think these characters have. I did think they had an effect on me at a young age. I've played in rock bands since I was a teenager. I've done that for my entire adult life. I absolutely love hard rock music. Um, I love all rock music, but hard rock music in particular, from multiple eras and generations. The first two Bill and Ted movies, Excellent Adventure and Bogus Journey, came out in 1989 and 1991, respectively. Um, and this was a particularly interesting time in music, especially in the rock world. The second movie, Bogus Journey, that came out either just before or right on the edge of this massive cultural shift that was going on at the time in music and pop culture. Many people associate that time, the 80s and the early 90s, with glam metal or hair metal, as people call it, which, by the way, that term was meant to be derogatory. It's not really an endearing term, so that's why I'm not too big of a fan of it personally. And a lot of people associate that time period with the glam hair bands, and how that particular aesthetic tended to oversaturate both rock music and culture as a whole. And certainly in the late 80s and early 90s, that was very much still the case. But I would also argue that rock music was still evolving quite a bit. There was a rising popularity of some heavier bands that weren't particularly that didn't particularly all sound the same. They weren't completely polished. They weren't corporatized, I guess. There were still some really interesting bands doing some cool stuff, and a lot of that, I would argue, started with Guns N' Roses. From Appetite for Destruction in 1987. Metallica was starting to become more popular. There were bands like Skid Row, King's X, Extreme, Megadeth, Pantera. Um, a lot of more original alternative rock bands like Faith No More, Living Color, Jane's Addiction, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and many others that were starting to come out around that time. And some of them survived a little bit longer. Some of them didn't. I could go on a whole tangent about what was going on in music at the time, and you know, granted, at the time I was still very young, so I didn't really understand what was happening. But like I said, I could talk for hours about that sort of thing. But I bring all this up because when it comes to Bill and Ted, I bring all this up for a reason. Bill and Ted, to me, I think represented a particular time and era in rock music where things were still very fun and optimistic and hopeful. Bill and Ted weren't necessarily glam rockers, but they were about as far from being angsty and moody as you could be. And in fact, the entire premise of the characters was centered around the idea that these two boys were destined to one day form a guitar driven rock band, Wyld Stallyns, and that Wyld Stallyns would become the most popular and influential rock band in history, eclipsing Elvis, Presley, the Beatles, or anyone else. And not only was this the case in this series, but the whole premise was that Wyld Stallyns' music was said to become the foundation upon which society would be built, as far in the future as 700 years. That their music would not only bring an end to war and poverty on Earth, but would inspire contact with other worlds and extraterrestrial life, presumably throughout the known universe. Now, that's a pretty fantastic premise. It's obviously that could only happen in fantasy. But as a child, that always resonated with me. And I found that to be such an interesting premise for these characters, and really made them out to be, I thought, very important. And in hindsight, it's even more interesting to me that the second movie, Bogus Journey, that ended with Bill and Ted seemingly reaching their potential and playing to a concert that was broadcast around the world. And it was implied that Wyld Stallyns had indeed fulfilled the destiny that was foretold to them by Rufus, who of course was played by the late great George Carlin. I find it even more telling that this was from a movie that came out in 1991, the same year that this big cultural shift in music began. Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey was released the same year as Nirvana's Nevermind album was. In a lot of ways, I felt that Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey was one of the last 80s movies, even though it was in 1991. And I imagine it must have been, I imagine it was probably a little polarizing to audiences and critics at the time, you know, probably even more so than Excellent Adventure had been merely 2 years earlier. But that's always something interesting I found about, especially that second movie and when it came out. But fast forward to nearly 30 years later, when Bill and Ted Face the Music was released in 2020, and the plot of that movie centered on a now middle-aged Bill and Ted, who it was implied that they had achieved some measure of success during the 90s, including performing at the Grand Canyon, which is amazing. But their career had drastically fizzled out by 2020. Now, they weren't necessarily broke or financially destitute. They lived in the movie that they were shown to have lived in relatively average middle class homes with their wives and daughters, but they were essentially out of the music business and seemingly forgotten by their fans. But yeah, I mean, they were relative unknowns by that point, which I always found that to be a bit of a surprising plot point, since at the end of Bogus Journey, they played literally for a global audience. So, but obviously it was exaggerated for comedy's sake, and at one point they had this really funny accidental encounter with Dave Grohl, who I would have thought Dave Grohl, who's a massive rock star and a huge music fan as well, might have recognized them as like, hey, I remember you guys from the '90s, Wild Stallions, but I guess not. In Face the Music, Bill and Ted were tasked with writing and performing a song that would unite humanity across all of space and time, and they achieved this with the help of their daughters, Billy and Thea, who ended up displaying a knack for arranging and producing music despite not being musicians themselves. Now, while this wasn't the original premise of the first two movies, because originally they said that their band and career as a whole was supposed to be what was important, not just one song in particular. It definitely made sense for this particular movie. And as a longtime Bill and Ted fan, I didn't, I did not dislike the movie. Of course, there were things that I would have done differently, but on the whole, I was just happy to see Reeves and Winter on screen again, reprising these iconic characters. It's a shame it took them as long as it did to get that third movie made, but I was happy to catch up with these characters who I have loved since I was a little boy. Um, and I know at the beginning of Face the Music, there was a montage that inspired me to think about what a fake documentary about the Wild Stallions' career would be like. I've always loved movies like This Is Spinal Tap, Airheads, Wayne's World, Rockstar with Mark Wahlberg, CB4 with Chris Rock, Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, or like Pop Star, Never Stop, Never Stopping, with Andy Samberg, and anything else that sort of involves music or a comedy that involves music or sort of lovingly pokes fun at the music industry. I'm also a big fan of the Blues Brothers and the rock band Fozzy, featuring Chris Jericho, who has they have a fake they had a fake documentary at the beginning of their career, complete with a fake backstory and cameos by real musicians, and I found that to be very funny and entertaining. And I'm also inspired by the movie Anvil, the story of Anvil, which was an unscripted film that documented the lives of the veteran Canadian metal band Anvil, who they had been gaining some momentum in the early '80s, but their careers never quite achieved the success as a lot of their contemporaries. And the documentary featured like testimonials by real life rock icons like Lemmy, Slash, Lars Ulrich, among many others. And these guys would talk about how much they liked Anvil, and they couldn't understand why they never got bigger than they had been. And in their opinions, they felt that Anvil should have had much more success than they had. I would love to see something like that made for the Wyld Stallyns, to see a fake documentary about the rise and fall and eventual comeback, sort of documenting the events between Bogus Journey and Face the Music, as well as the aftermath of Face the Music. I would love nothing more than to see a montage of some of the biggest names in rock music of the past 30 years talk about what huge influences the Wild Stallions were on them. I think of names like the Foo Fighters, Shinedown, Breaking Benjamin, Zach Wild, Greta Van Fleet, System of a Down, Disturbed, Avenged Sevenfold, Wolfgang Van Halen, Nickelback, Stained, Linkin Park, Creed / Alter Bridge, Imagine Dragons, My Chemical Romance, Three Doors Down, Incubus, 3 Days Grace, and Weezer. Weezer did a soundtrack song on the soundtrack for Face the Music. So did Mastodon. There's just so many names I could think of who I would love to see, like, be a part of something like that, and who I think would definitely play along with it. Um, and not only bands that they would have inspired, but also like, classic, rock icons, these legends like Slash, like the guys from Metallica, like Sir Paul McCartney, Sammy Hagar, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Ringo Starr, Alice Cooper, Steven Tyler, Brian May, Roger Taylor, Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, the guys from AC/DC, Rush, Kiss, Ice-T, Pearl Jam, Anthrax, Tom Morello, all these guys who might have been, either their contemporaries or, guys who inspired them. And it would be funny to see all them, see names like that kind of sitting down and saying, it's like, man, whatever happened to the Stallions? Like, they could have been the next Rolling Stones. And, what made them fall apart during the 2000s or the 2010s or whenever it happened in the movie. You could throw in notable media personalities like Eddie Trunk, Ricky Rackman, Matt Pinfield, et cetera, to give, some comments on their career and their influence. I feel like the cameos from real life musicians would definitely be a must for something like this. For example, I think it would be hilarious for like, the bands, for Wyld Stallyns' guitar tech to be Nuno Betancourt, who's one of the greatest guitar players in the world, or like their drum tech to be Mike Portnoy, something crazy like that. Sort of like, and Mike Portnoy did something like that in the Fozzy documentary. And speaking of that, there was also something in that documentary where Zach Wilde just goes off on this rant about how depressed he was because he wanted to join the band but wasn't able to. Um, it would actually be great to have Jane Weedland from the Go-Go's appear as herself, telling a story, recounting how Bill and Ted once met her and mistook her for Joan of Arc, which Jane Weedland, of course, played Joan of Arc in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I feel like that would be a cool little Easter egg. Another one of my favorite moments from Excellent Adventure, the first movie, was when Bill and Ted were in their garage at the beginning of the movie, and they talked about how badly they wanted to get Eddie Van Halen to join their band. And, that was part of their motivation to make their first music video. Now, I had read a story in which, when the movie came out, that Eddie had loved that scene. And supposedly at the premiere of the movie, he had like joked to the press. He's like, yeah, I would have joined their band if they asked me. Now, I don't know if he would ever do such a thing, like if this project ever got off the ground, if there was ever something like this that would be made. I don't know if he would want to do it, but part of me, I imagine someone like Wolfgang Van Halen, who's Eddie's son, who's making quite a name for himself and branching out on his own and really becoming his own man. But I wonder if Wolfgang would ever. I could imagine him doing an interview about how he idolized Wyld Stallyns growing up, and how, his dad would talk about how his dad loved the band as well. And maybe he could tell us, like a fake story about his dad would call Bill and Ted and ask their advice on guitar playing, or maybe have a story about Eddie openly wishing that he could have joined Wyld Stallyns. I feel like that would be not only a funny callback to that classic gag, but I feel like that would be a heartfelt tribute to Eddie as well, since he's no longer with us. One thing I'm curious about as far as like the storytelling in these movies is that I don't know if Bill and Ted's ability to time travel was ever public knowledge. I imagine that it wasn't, because like Ted's dad, for example, he still didn't believe them until the end of Face the Music. But that would be funny to explore. That is how you'd have interviews from scientists who speculate this, like if you could get like Neil deGrasse Tyson or somebody of that nature. On a related note, Face the Music never addressed what happened to Station after the events of Bogus Journey. I know Kid Cudi actually he referenced Station at the end of the movie, but It would also be funny, I think, to see footage of like religious leaders across the world asking a few questions about death, about the Grim Reaper, and the rumors that Bill and Ted had once been killed and resurrected from the dead. You could understand how some people might speculate that the Wyld Stallyns' musical abilities may have had some divine influence. After all, in Bogus Journey, they literally went to heaven and spoke directly with God. So, you could definitely throw that in there. Um, Along the way, you could, I imagine, if you were going to do this, you could also have like there being an underlying plot thread as to who may have been responsible for sabotaging the Wyld Stallyns' career. Perhaps there was a corrupt producer, a manager, a record executive who might have led them to make some poor decisions along the way. In Face the Music, it was heavily implied that Bill and Ted's falling out with the Grim Reaper, that's what contributed to the band's downfall. Now, Death inexplicably became the Wyld Stallyns' bass player at the end of Bogus Journey. And even during the end credits of Bogus Journey, there were flashes of news articles about how Death had recorded a solo album and split from the band only to rejoin later. And which, by the way, William Sadler's portrayal of the Grim Reaper is one of the funniest additions to the Bill and Ted mythos. And his dynamic with the two of them is absolutely hysterical. One of the complaints I had about Face the Music, I wish we had more of Death on screen because he was just so funny. And if we were going to do a documentary like this, I can only imagine like the outrageous diva-like behavior Death would exhibit as the Wyld Stallyns get their first taste of success. The money, the women, having an entourage, the fame would just go to his head immediately. I can imagine him, riding in limos, like, having like this ridiculous entourage, going to red carpet events, the Met Gala, award shows, having relationships with famous actresses, models, and singers, influencers. And of course, he would have to briefly get married to Missy at one point. I feel like you'd have to throw that in there somewhere. I'd love for there to be a few jokes about how legendary rockers like Ozzy Osbourne and Keith Richards, Slash and Nikki Sixx, and others have somehow managed to elude death in more ways than one, and how he'd be upset about it. Maybe they beat him in one of his contests the way Bill and Ted did in Bogus Journey, but maybe he was too embarrassed to admit it. You could have a lot of fun with that. What was that? I got a little sidetracked there talking about the Reaper for a second, but I feel like having like an overarching plot thread that, the fact that their career got derailed as it did, or as it was implied to have been in Face the Music. In my mind, that leaves a couple of theories about how that could have happened, and that maybe some of their previous time travel adventures may have inadvertently changed their timeline, and maybe that had delayed their career success. Because in Bogus Journey, we saw how Chuck Denomalos, how he sent the two evil Bill and Ted robots, the cyborgs, back in time, essentially like Terminators, back in time to 1991 to kill and replace Bill and Ted before the Battle of the Bands in San Dimas. Which, funny enough, that movie came out the same year as Terminator 2, Judgment Day, 1991. So, kind of a curious coincidence. To me, but getting back to this movie, to me, that always raised questions about the nature of time travel in the Bill and Ted universe. For example, would they have broken up if Rufus did not help them with their history report in 1988? Also, if Bill and Ted had never died and met death, would he have ever come, to the realm of the living and become their bass player? Keeping all that in mind, it's not hard to imagine that Denomalos's actions in 1991 could have altered the timeline. For example, Denomalos broadcasted the Battle of the Bands in order to publicly execute Bill and Ted, as well as to spread his own message to the world. Now, of course, Bill and Ted ended up defeating him, and his plan backfired. and the entire world got to see the Wyld Stallyns perform at the Battle of the Bands. But what if there was some sort of failsafe or backup plan that Denomalos had built in? Um, for example, in Bogus Journey, we last saw Denomalos being arrested by Ted's dad, Captain Logan. And the actor who played Chuck Denomalos was a guy named Joss Ackland, who many people my age might remember him for his role as Hans in the Mighty Ducks movies. Now, Mr. Ackland has been retired since 2014, and he's 95 years old. He is still alive as of this recording. It seems unlikely that he would reprise the role of Denomalos at this point or in the near future, but it would certainly make sense for that character to want to see Bill and Ted fail and have some sort of backup plan. Denomalos was Bill and Ted's archenemy, and he would certainly have the most to gain from seeing the Wyld Stallyns fall into obscurity. And it would make sense to me that he would somehow find a way to sabotage the band's career. Maybe he might somehow have used his knowledge of the future to recruit followers to his cause. Maybe they might somehow infiltrate and secretly work within the music industry, within the press, or even within the Wyld Stallyns' own management or inner circle to somehow undermine their popularity or influence. In addition to sabotaging their own interpersonal relationships with each other. Um, Speaking of that, Face the Music suggested that at some point, not only did Death leave the band, but Joanna and Elizabeth had left the band as well. Now, when Rufus brought the two princesses back to 1988 from medieval England, they became part of the band. Joanna was on drums, and Elizabeth was on keyboards. And I always assumed maybe she sang too, but maybe she had some vocals as well, but that was never shown in the movies. Now, although the two sisters both remained married to Bill and Ted, it would be interesting to know why they ended up leaving the band. Maybe it was for financial reasons. I mean, obviously they all stayed together, in their personal lives. They still stayed married, but they left the band, and maybe they felt it was best to step away from being on the road and focus on being mothers to their daughters. Obviously, they both loved their husbands, but maybe they were concerned about the toll that their failing music career might have taken on them and the family. I mean, it was definitely suggested in the movie in Face the Music that without Death and Joanna and Elizabeth in the band, that the Wyld Stallyns' popularity declined, despite Bill and Ted's best efforts to keep it going. Um, I also wonder, I wonder who their replacements in the band could have been. Maybe they would have been secretly been followers of Denomalos' cause and maybe deliberately tried to destroy the band from the inside out. Maybe they could have been famous, other famous musicians. There are a lot of possibilities you can go with there. Now, in addition to that main plot, I feel like it would be really entertaining to see footage documenting the Wyld Stallyns' career over the years. Um, you I'm talking about like concert clips to behind the scenes footage of them in the studio, on the road, or at home with their families, and interviews and media appearances. There's a lot you can do there. You know, you look at AI and deep fake technology that's out right now. That's advanced quite a bit in recent years. And so I feel like de-aging Alex Winter and Keanu Reeves wouldn't be all that difficult. And you also have the last 30 plus years of publicity photos and archival footage of the two of them um, together from years ago, and they've certainly stayed friends over the years, even though they haven't really worked publicly together for a long time. But there's a lot of probably archival footage you could use in something like this. So that was some of the ideas I had. And finally, one gag that I would love to see if this fake documentary ever got made. I would love to see a roundtable discussion between Death and the greatest bass players in the world. Um, to have Death sitting down with like the best bass players in the world, comparing techniques and ideas, and to have Death just suggest the most outrageous, absurd bass techniques imaginable with a straight face. Like, doing things that would be physically impossible. And just playing it straight, um, I'm talking people like Geddy Lee, Les Claypool, Victor Wooten, Flea, Stanley Clark, Geezer Butler, Randy Jackson, Steve Harris, Carol Kay, Bootsy Collins, Billy Sheehan, Gene Simmons, Duff McKagan, Jason Newsted, Robert Trujillo, Johnny Christ from Avenged Sevenfold, Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth, Larry Graham, Esperanza Spalding, Justin Chancellor from Tool, Rudy Sarzo. Just those are just names that come to my head that I was writing down. But I mean, you could. There's so many different names you could get. I just feel like with William Sadler's delivery as Death, I feel like, at least for other musicians, I feel like that would be comedy gold. Um, and I feel like Les Claypool would definitely consider it. He's got that sense of humor. Plus, Primus was actually one of the bands that appeared in the Battle of the Bands in Bogus Journey. They were playing Tommy the Cat, and I feel like Geddy Lee would do it in a heartbeat. He's got that sense of humor, and he would have so much fun with it. Um, Speaking of Death, I always wondered, like, in the movies, like who could have filled in for him in the afterlife, when he's busy on Earth with the Wild Stallions. You'd have to have somebody, you would have to have somebody in the hereafter, escorting the souls of the deceased into the afterlife. Maybe perhaps an iconic rock star who is no longer with us. We know that in Face the Music, Jimi Hendrix had met and jammed with Bill and Ted, so that would be an amazing choice. I would personally go with Freddie Mercury, and maybe maybe have Freddie played by Rami Malek, who won an Oscar for his portrayal in Bohemian Rhapsody. Um, Ironically enough, this is a bizarre coincidence, but Freddie Mercury had passed away in 1991 when Bogus Journey was released. So that it's sort of a sad coincidence there. But you could think of so many rock icons who are no longer with us. I feel like John Lennon or Randy Rhoads. Maybe they wouldn't be bad choices either. Um, so many different possibilities there. Now, I doubt. I know this is all wishful thinking. All right, I doubt something like this would ever get made. But as a Bill and Ted fan and as a music fan, I would just the thought of the Wild Stallions having their own like documentary or something like that just brings a smile on my face. I mean, I don't know if something like that would ever be released in the movie theaters, but maybe direct to video or direct to streaming, like I could totally see that. Not to mention, I've always had questions about their band that I would love to see answered. For example, who would be the lead singer of Wild Stallions? Did Bill and Ted sing? Did Joanna, Elizabeth, or Death? Did any of them sing as well? I can imagine, they'd be kind of like the Beatles, where it's like, you'd have multiple members of the band as lead singers, or like Fleetwood Mac kind of did stuff like that, or there have been a few bands that have done things like that. Um, Also, like I wonder what happened after the end of Face the Music. The movie that movie ended with literally all of humanity across time and space jamming together on one song. How could everyone possibly remember that after it happens? How would that be explained without reality collapsing in on itself like it was supposed to in the movie? What other I think about things like that as a fan, and I wonder what other questions you guys listening would want to see answered. What other fictional bands would you want the Wild Stallions to meet along the way? I always joked around, like, I wonder if this was ever possible, like if there was a crossover that ever happened, which I don't think it would because they're owned by separate studios. But could you imagine if Bill and Ted one day met Wayne and Garth? Maybe the Wild Stallions would headline Wayne Stock. Things like that would be fun to speculate about. So let me know in the comments. So there you go. Those are some ideas I had for that. I do have some ideas for what a possible fourth Bill and Ted movie might be, if there was ever a proper sequel done to Face the Music. I do have an idea for that, but I think I'll save that for another video. But those are some ideas I had for if there were ever a Bill and Ted, Wild Stallions documentary. I feel like that would be a lot of fun, especially for the music geeks like me and people who are like really big fans of the series as well. So I feel like that would be a lot of fun, especially depending on who they could get, to cameo in it. Um, but what suggestions would you have? What would you like to see in a documentary like this, or what sort of ideas for more adventures for Bill and Ted to go on? What would you want to see? Make sure you leave some comments about it. But that's going to be it for now. Make sure you follow me on Twitter or you can always leave a comment here, or if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can always email me at jackconnorpodcast@gmail.com, or you could tweet me with the hashtag Phoenix Report. I don't even know if it's called tweets anymore. Um, no matter where you're listening to this, if you're watching this on YouTube or listening to it, via podcast, I'll also put this up as this will mainly be a YouTube exclusive, but also put an audio version of this on the podcast feed as well. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell if there's one there. You can leave a comment, go back and to listen or watch the other episodes I've done. I actually did a feature length commentary track on Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I could post a link to that in the description as well. I still would love to do some commentary tracks for the other movies as well. But as always, I appreciate you guys watching and sticking with me this long and just kind of fanboying out with me as I usually like to do. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to this. I love doing these videos for you. Um, I appreciate you tuning in as always. So with that, I will just leave you all. And this is Jack Connor reminding all of you to be excellent to each other. Party on, dudes. So thank you guys as always for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Make sure you do all the YouTube things, hit like I mentioned before. This has been the Phoenix Report. This has been the Fireside Chat. And my name is Jack Connor, as always, reminding you all, no matter what you do, be excellent to each other. Party on, dudes.